Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of My Bigfoot Sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, love's in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland roads where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
If you'd like to be able to listen to the show without ads and have full access to bonus content, that's an option. To find out how, please go to mybigfootsighting.com.
My Bigfoot Sightings started in 2008, and actually it wasn't a sighting initially. It was hearing a callback from the woods. I was actually on a BFRO expedition in Arizona, and a call was made from the top of a ridge, and the teams had split up into two distinct groups on either side of this ridge. And when the expedition leader let out a call from the ridge, the teams that were on the east side of the ridge didn't hear anything except for the BFRO call. The team on the west side, which myself and my son were involved with, we heard a call back within about 7 seconds from the initial call, and it came from the north. And then followed by about 3 seconds later, a call from the northwest, followed by about another 5-6 seconds after that, a call from the southwest back. And they were all slightly different, but much deeper than the organizer's howl that he had done. And it was life-altering because at that time, being an analyst and a inquisitive person, I ended up deciding that I needed to find out what that was or do further research into that. So over time, I spent a lot of time out in the woods, camping here in Arizona initially, taking my kids up. We had a lot of experiences with Sasquatch that would come in close to camp and whistle right around 2-3 in the morning, and that, their whistling would be back and forth on either side of the campsite. So it was not a bird, and it was very methodical. And in between the whistling and kind of the circling of camp, you could hear footfalls as well. So as I learned more about initially, I started getting out of the woods in order to get evidence, make other people understand or believe, and capture evidence that would explain to others what I had experienced and what others have experienced. And it did not work out like that. Initially I would put up game cameras. I'd set up camera traps everywhere. I set up audio traps, which I did capture a lot of amazing audio of knocks and whoops and howls. It really wasn't definitive other than the fact that, a lot of the vocalizations were well outside the human range. So I got to also thinking back on my experiences when I was hiking throughout Arizona, and from probably 1978 onward up until 2008, the camping and hiking trips that I went on, there were unusual things that happened, or there were unusual things that I found that I wrote off as, well, that's weird. Why would a human be doing this out in the middle of nowhere? I just hiked 15 miles in the middle of nowhere, off the beaten path, not on a standard trail, and I find this woven nest. But these are things going way back into the 80s. I also heard in the early 80s a howl with two friends of mine. And in fact, we were camped on the far side of a lake at night. We had taken a small boat over to that side of the lake, and here's three guys at 2:33 in the morning trying to decide if we should just leave all our camping gear and get in the boat and get out of there, because it was so incredibly loud, and the vibrations on our chests were incredible. But we finally talked ourselves into that it was maybe a large coyote. But now thinking back on that, that really was not a possibility. But there's a lot of people, I think, out there that have those similar experiences, but they write them off or try to explain them away with something that's logical or something known, when truly there is something unknown out there. So fast forward to 2009, I had taken my kids out earlier that day, setting up some audio traps, and we ended up finding a trackway. And this trackway consisted of 15-inch prints. It was in forest litter. Arizona historically has harder soils unless you catch us during the monsoon season or right after snowmelt. And I know a lot of people, that, just to set the stage, a lot of people think about Arizona as being sand dunes and saguaro cactuses, but truly over half the state is pine trees and mountains. So this is in a mountainous area, but this trackway, we followed it for over a quarter mile. And it was, like I said, in pine needles and forest litter, but consistent 15-inch prints, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. And I was initially started documenting and taking photos of every print. And then after we realized that it continued on, I stopped taking photos of them. So I didn't take a photo of every single print, but we get up to this area that overlooked the lake. And at that overlook, we went to kind of rest up there because it was a pretty arduous hike. And we get up into this area, and right on this big rock ledge, first thing I noticed that's at the top of this thing, kind of shaded, secluded, there's this giant butt print. And not only is it a butt print, but it's a very recent butt print, because the grasses that had been flattened by whatever had sat down there, the grasses were just starting to rebound a little bit. So it was momentary. And both my kids are in the medical field. And my daughter looks down and she says, "Dad, is that blood?" So we look down on the ground, and kind of right below where the butt print is off this ledge there's drops of blood. And this blood is just starting to coagulate. So very, very fresh. And we ended up collecting all of that. Actually, I still have that in my freezer, because I actually don't know who would be a trustworthy DNA source. So if anybody hears this and is interested, please contact me. But we bagged all of that. So what we had really found on the way up there, when I went back and reviewed the photos of the footprints, was you could see in the left foot that there was actually a blood drop that was in some of the left feet photos that I took. So this individual had a cut foot, sat down up at the ledge, just like you or I would do, and was probably looking at their foot, the cut in their foot, when it heard us coming and it fled. So I was pretty impressed with that, what I would still call an encounter evidence. Later that evening, we went back to the campsite. We made dinner. We had a great time just hanging out. And then my nephew, who was with us, and my kids all went out about 10 p.m., 10 p.m. at night, we were going to do couple knocks and just see what kind of responses we get. My original thought was, well, they'll hear them respond like they had done to me in the past couple of years, a year and a half. So I thought that we would just be hearing them. And what happened was my kids got tired. They ended up staying back in the car. So my nephew and I were kind of left out in the dark, literally. And I did a knock on a tree in this canyon. And within seconds, it was returned with a whoop sound coming from about, I would venture, about a quarter mile to the west of our location. So we waited a little bit longer, maybe about 10, 15 minutes. And then we did another knock. And when we did that, the whoop came back, and it was right across the canyon from us, right on the other side of the canyon. It was really close. My nephew asked, "Are you going to knock back? Are you going to call them?" And I go, "No, it knows exactly where we are." So all we were armed with at the time was a night vision monocular, which did not record. So we were kind of passing the night vision back and forth. It had about a 2 times magnification, and it had a infrared spotlight attached to it. So you could really see well with this monocular. And a couple minutes later, we heard a kind of a rock scrabble down into the canyon, down to the bottom of the canyon, and, just kind of loose rock fall. And then I could hear brush moving on our side of the canyon wall, kind of coming up the slope. And then it stopped. And as we were looking down the edge of this thick brush, every once in a while you'd see something kind of peek out really quick and duck back in. Peek out really quick, duck back in. And it did this about 5 or 6 times, enough that both my nephew and I witnessed it. And then it stopped doing it. And then I could very incredibly quietly, you could just barely make out these footfalls coming up the hill. But it was so quiet, so I started calling them forest ninjas. And this was like in 2008, because they could just lay their foot down so quietly, even on forest litter. It was remarkable. And then it stopped. And I know it was close enough that it was looking at us, but it wasn't making any sound. And even though my nephew got to hear interaction, I was hoping we would be able to see one, because I hadn't seen one. And, who knows, maybe I was just making all this up, right? So knowing that they have a proclivity to parallel you in the woods. So they're interested to know, especially if you're out hiking in the dark in the woods without a flashlight on, they're very interested to know where you're going and what you're doing. And it's an unusual activity that a human would do, of walking in the woods at night or not having any lights on. So knowing that it would probably parallel us, I told my nephew, I said, we'll just walk back towards the car. And as we're walking back towards the car, I'll just tell you to stop. And when you stop, just be very quiet. Then I'll listen and see if it's following us. So we started walking an angle back up towards the car, which was on this logging road. And as we got about maybe, 15, 20 feet away from where we initially were, I told him, stop. And we stopped, and there was one additional footstep that came from the slope of the canyon. So I knew it was following us. So then I whispered into his ear, I said, okay, you remember when we hung up audio traps earlier? There was this area that there was no brush, that you could see all the way down to the creek bed in the canyon. And he said, yeah, it's a big open area. And I said, we're going to walk back towards the car. And if I hear it in that area, I said, I want you just to spin around and look with the night vision scope that direction. He goes, okay. So here's this 12-year-old kid that's been out in the woods on an actual Sasquatch investigation research for about 53 minutes. I hear a twig snap in that opening in the vegetation, and I tell him, now. He spins around. I didn't spin around because I wanted to keep the agitation down to a minimum. So it was just my nephew swings around with the night vision scope. And first thing out of his mouth, he says, yep, there it is. I said, what's it doing? And he said, looking at me. I said, give me the scope. And he handed me the scope. And by the time he handed me the scope, the subject was already in mid-motion from the center of that gap in the vegetation off to the side to get behind a tree. And the glimpse that I got of the step and a half that I saw, it was a female. And everybody always asks me, how could you tell it was a female? Well, I actually saw a left breast because she was running from my viewpoint from right to left. So she gets behind this tree, and the hill, as it turned out later on when we tried to recreate this, because everybody said, I don't understand why the Sasquatch, this Bigfoot, left their hand on the side of the tree to be visible. And I said, I couldn't tell you that. I mean, I don't know why. So I'm 6'5". I went to go recreate that and put the hand in the position where her hand was. Immediately when I got behind that tree in the recreation, I discovered that the slope of the canyon wall right there there was a game trail that ran just below that, but where that tree was that she hid behind, the slope was very steep. And if you did not hang on to the tree in some manner, you would just fall backwards down the hill. So it was a necessity for her to do that. My nephew and I stood there with the night vision scope. Like I said, was about 2 times magnification. The tree was about 30 feet from us. So very, very close. And then the scope did the 2 times magnification. So very, very close. And the neat thing was that she kept that hand there for 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, you could see the fingernails, the infrared light from our scope reflecting off the fingernails. And you could see the fingernails were kind of, I wouldn't say cracked, but jagged and rough at the edges. The fingers were, I want to say, like a ballpark frank compared to my fingers. And I wear like a size 12 ring. So it was probably a good, probably 1.5 to 1 3/4 larger in size. The hair that hung off her forearm, which was about, I want to say, the hair was probably about 4 inches, 4.5 inches maybe off the forearm. There was hair on the back of the hand, but not very thick. The fingers probably had hair, but not as visible. And the skin was kind of a darker color, obviously with night vision, everything is green, but there was just a slight breeze that evening, and the hair on her forearm was swaying in this probably 2 to 3 mile an hour little breeze that was going through the woods. And she kept her hand like that for about 3 minutes. And then after about 3 minutes, she withdrew her hand, and then we didn't hear anything. So we sat down, we tried to knock some rocks together. I talked at length in her direction, and there was no responses to it. I'm pretty sure that she was still there in the bushes, but wasn't making a sound. And then probably after about 10 minutes of trying to communicate behind the road on the other side of the vehicle, I could hear something was coming down the hillside from the east. And that was about the time that I got to thinking about what trouble I'd get in if I had to come back home and tell my sister-in-law that her son had been eaten. So I decided that was probably a good enough time to pack it in. And boy, my nephew was completely excited, got into the car. My kids kind of woke up and they were like, he's just went on and on and on and on and on. He just couldn't control himself. But the moment we got back into camp, I think it started, the reality started to sink into him. And he, in the tent that night, he became very panicked and, was a lot of angst, knowing that what he saw was real and that maybe it'll come get him that night, and of course, this is a 12-year-old, right? So I truly felt for him. But when we went back later and tried to reenact the sighting, and this is kind of like more of the scientist side of me, trying to determine if you put your hand straight out, if you were going to hold on to a pole, let's say in front of you, you would put your arm straight out and hold it straight out. So your hand would be likely, in most cases, pretty much parallel with the top of your shoulder. So we measured from the ground up to where the hand was actually on the tree. And that distance from the ground to where the hand was on the tree was 6'8" if I'm recalling correctly. So 6'8" we used as a basis to go from the bottom of her left foot up to the top of her left shoulder out to her hand, right? So if her shoulder was 6'8" tall, then some unknown ratio, right? If we can borrow from humans, she'd be probably 7'2", 7'3", in my estimation, at minimum. And that really sealed the deal, unless there was some exceptionally tall, hairy woman running through the woods. I would venture to guess that I saw a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. That, of course, enticed me more to get further evidence, and also had me lament that I did not have a device that could record at nighttime. So I ended up purchasing a FLIR that could record as well. But as it turned out, I didn't need that, because the second sighting I had was a year later, same canyon in Arizona. This is 2010. I had hiked up into this meadow region at the south end of the canyon. I was trying to head back to my vehicle, and I kind of had gotten a little lost because I had dropped a pin on my GPS device. I actually went and took my backpack off, pulled my GPS out. I was trying to fire it up and have it connect to the satellites so I could get my bearings on which direction to go. And as I'm standing there doing that, I suddenly hear a sound up on the ridge up to my right, to the west of me. And it was about, let's see, what time was it? It was about 1:30 in the afternoon. So the sun was just on the other side of the peak over the trees right there. And I looked up there, and I only caught just a slight glimpse of something running, like the last, I want to say 10 feet before this brush. And I couldn't, just the glimpse I caught, I couldn't quite tell what it was. And I got to thinking to myself, okay, if it was a Sasquatch following me up into this area, it probably is still in that brush watching me. If it was something like an elk or a deer up there, and those were the only two things I could think of, and probably even a mule deer because of the size of the object that I saw, it probably would have kept running. But of course, after it reached that brush, I didn't hear any further trampling in the woods. So I took my pack off. I took everything off. I got my camera out. I took my lens cap off, the SLR camera, and I started walking in that direction. I was going to go walk up the hill right towards where that thick brush is, with the reasoning, if it was not a Sasquatch, there'd be nothing up there. If it was a Sasquatch, then maybe I'll capture some photographic evidence. So I start walking that direction. Of course, I'm by myself on this trip. And as I start walking up that hill, and I get right to the bottom of that hill, heading in the exact direction where I last saw it, it comes bursting out of that brush. And I've never seen anything run that was so large, run so fast, and so smoothly. It was not lopey at all in the run. It was a perfect gliding gait, but I would have to estimate anywhere from 25 to 30 miles an hour. The speed for the size was astonishing. And not only that, but it was completely backlit by the sun, and the sun was shining through its hair along this ridge as it ran. And I always like to joke that the hair flowed as it ran. And I said it was, if you've ever seen like a L'Oreal commercial where the hair gets tossed, or the silky smooth flow of hair, it was just like that. It was amazing. But the hair was reddish brown in color, and it was 2 seconds. It covered the distance from the thick brush to behind additional thicker brush, and you could hear it go down the ridge on the other side, so out of view. But it was so astonishing that your first reaction, and it's hard to overcome that. I mean, we're built that way as humans, right? We're not, even though I was mentally prepared to walk up there and photograph a Sasquatch, I was stunned by what I saw enough that it took me about a second and a half. And by the time I started lowering the camera to take a picture, it was gone. And, there's a lot of people that have sightings like that. And I know that there's other people that go out and buy sunglasses that have cameras in them, except that, the camera quality is really horrible. And then you end up with blob pictures and things that don't look like anything, much less unknown primate. And since then, other people have said, get a GoPro attached to your helmet. That's a great thing, except a lot of times you could walk through the woods for 5 hours and not see anything. And, it's that fleeting moment that you have to have everything, all your tumblers in place to unlock that mystery. But it's tough. It's very tough. And then the other thing, of course, is that if you're trying to strap on a camera and you're under forest canopy, it's kind of dim and dark, and cameras, unless you have incredibly high-end cameras, really don't do video capture that serves it justice. So I did walk up the hill, and other than the steps right where it launched from behind that brush, where the forest litter was really scattered and, you could tell a large footprint had shuffled that apart, it did not leave any prints along that ridgeline that I could find. So it was an incredible sighting, but I've actually had better sightings than a daytime sighting like that. So my third sighting was in 2011, the year later. I had done some scouting on a location to hold the BFRO 2011 expedition in Arizona. And as we were looking for that location, I was familiar with this canyon. I'd hiked in it many times before, and some of its tributary canyons. And it's very remote, there are a lot of logging roads to give good access into areas, but it's still not well traveled by many hikers in a year. So I deemed that an ideal location. So we went there, and the very first day that we were there, we discovered an oak tree that had a large branch that was about 10 feet off the ground. It was apparent that something had climbed up the tree, stood on that large oak limb, and then they were picking acorns off of the upper branches of the oak tree. And all of these small branches that the acorns were on were all twisted off, snapped off. So every single one of them was twisted and pulled off, twisted, pulled off. If you try to do that to a tree in your yard, just try to twist even a small twig on there, they're very flexible and they don't really want to come off. But you could tell these were just almost twist, pinch. And there was probably well over 100 of these down on the ground below. So whatever had been doing this was standing on this branch 10 feet off the ground, picking acorns off the tree from about 10 to 12 feet off of the top of the branch. It was very suspect, I'll put it that way. And of course, the acorns, you could see, had been picked off of the branches down below. So, imagine if you were picking apples, right? Maybe you were dropping them down to your family members down below. A very similar situation. So I was very encouraged by this. Obviously it wasn't definitive proof of anything, but that very next night would give us some insight. So this was the first trip that I actually could use my thermal on, and I took a group to the far side of the canyon. If anybody's been on a BFRO expedition, that they'll set up across different areas and then call back and forth to each of the groups in order to entice some action from the actual Bigfoots. So our group was on the far side, and while we were kind of waiting out in our position to do knocks and calls from that location, we could hear something coming closer to us, but we couldn't see anything on the thermal. All night we were entertaining ourselves watching mice and squirrels and other things waking up and running around in the woods at night, but nothing large at all. But we could hear something large was moving in our direction, and then it stopped and it was quiet. That seemed fairly odd. So when we finished up the evening, one of the people on the expedition, I had her, I said, well, why don't you roll down the window and you could use the thermal and I'll just drive slow and you look out in the woods in that direction that we heard the cracks in as we're heading out on this logging road out of this area. So I was driving, she's out in the back looking, and all of a sudden she says, oh my gosh. She's like, there's something with a huge heat signature that was standing in between these two trees, looking in our direction as we drove past. And I said, how far on? She goes, it was like maybe 30 feet off the road. So you can imagine that heat signature was pretty large. So I slammed on the brakes, and I was only going maybe 5 miles an hour. I slammed on the brakes, I threw it in reverse and backed up. And by the time I backed up just probably 40 feet before I stopped and threw it in reverse, we got back to where the two trees were, and there was nothing standing in between them at that point. So I was pretty excited that I had gotten somebody else a Class A sighting. So we returned back to camp, and we get back to camp, and it took quite a while. It almost took us 45 minutes to drive back there through all the logging roads and highways. And we get back around there, and we get into camp, and everybody in camp they're doing knocks and whooping and making all kinds of sounds from the campsite, which that's something that I just rarely do. To me, it seems like it always irritates them. So I pulled up and I said, what are you guys doing? What's going on here? And they're like, oh, and of course the woman relays her sighting, what she saw on the thermal. But of course, the thermal could record, but in her excitement, she had forgotten to push the button to record, so did not capture an image of it. But we get back into camp, and she's relaying the story around the campfire. Everybody's listening to what she saw and what our experiences were out there. And as we're standing there, something from the woods throws a stick towards us and hits one of the vehicles in the camp. So everybody pauses. And of course, not thinking about it, I had left my thermal in my vehicle. Then the leader of the expedition, she had a thermal, but it was also in her vehicle on the other side of camp. So the two of us start walking back towards our vehicles to go grab the thermals. Well, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I was walking. I could see the taillights from my vehicle in the campfire light, and I start walking back towards the vehicle. And my best description could be I woke up and I was just standing in front of some brush that was probably 40 feet away from the vehicle. And I'm just standing there looking at this brush. And I wasn't sure exactly how I got there. I turned back around and I can see the vehicle off to my left. So I finally head over towards the vehicle and grabbed my thermal. Well, as it turns out, the expedition leader also, she had the same experience walking back to her van where she just walked in the wrong direction and she just didn't know where she was. So I call that lost time. I can't explain what it is, what happened, but the fact that it happened to two people on either side of a camp is certainly an interesting data point in the research. So we get back towards the camp and we assume that they're still out there. One of the guys says, well, I'm going to go get my gun out of my truck. So he runs back to his truck. And as he runs back to his truck, which is in the direction that the stick had come from, another stick flies in and hits the truck like right near him, right where he's about to get into his truck. And he just double backs right to the campfire. He doesn't get his gun. So we start walking through and trying to see if we can spot any heat signatures out in the woods. And I captured on my thermal something that later on, when we recreated it, was a height of 7'7", and it peaked around this tree. And you could just see this heat signature come right around the tree. The tree was cooler. It was pretty distinct, but it didn't like completely poke its head out or anything like that. It was very, very subtle. But then it went back behind the tree. And later on, one of the other expedition members actually had I believe a 4 or 6 camera infrared security camera setup that you could find at Sam's Club or Costco, something that you could set up around your house that has a DVR attached to it and everything. And it also had infrared spotlights on the cameras. So it actually captured right about the time that the figure ducked back behind the tree on me. From a time perspective, you could see two figures walking away, and because of the distance away, you can't quite make out what they are, but you can tell one is taller and one is shorter. But as they walk, they both turn, and their eyeballs are just saucers reflecting back that IR light from his cameras. So we kind of had video evidence, and we also had thermal evidence kind of coinciding, and not only that, but the experience. So that was an interesting encounter, and I count that one as a sighting, even though it was only on thermal. But the rest of the trip was fairly uneventful after that evening. But my next encounter was, and I have to include this in here, it was a sighting, and it was a daytime sighting, but I had driven back to Iowa for a car show, and I had trailered my classic car back there. And when the car show finished, the temperatures in Iowa were right around 102 to 104. And if you've ever been back in the Midwest, and if it's 102, 104, it is miserably humid. And I decided on the drive back to Arizona that since it was so hot, I was like, Sasquatch will be hot too. So why don't we just keep an eye out in all of the farm ponds and in rivers and creeks? And so my daughter's driving with me. So rather than taking Interstate 80 across Iowa, we end up taking, I can't remember the name, the U.S. highway that's just north of I-80, but we took that clear across Iowa until we got to Des Moines. And every single farm pond, every creek, everything, we kept our eyes peeled for the entire distance across Iowa. And by the time we reached Des Moines, we were starting to get weary of trying to be eagle eye along the water's edge. And so we're driving down Interstate 35, and my daughter kind of goes back to reading her phone, and I'm still driving south. We're trying to make it to Wichita that night, and we cross the border from Iowa into Missouri, and I'm looking intently still at rivers and creeks, and there's a couple lakes right along there that intersect I-35. But as we start getting further south, there's not a lot of creeks or lakes that intersect, and it's really back to farm ponds again. But I'm on Interstate 35, so I'm going, I can remember, 65 miles an hour. And by this time, the sun's getting low in the sky. It's about 5 p.m. And just north of Bethany, Missouri, there was some trees that were bordering a couple of farmlands right there. And there was a large farm pond there. And as I drove past it, right dead center in the middle of it, it looked like, initially I thought it was a stump, maybe a mossy stump that was in the middle of this pond. So as I'm driving, I thought that looks unusual. And then I noticed some concentric rings coming away from the stump when the rest of the pond was completely still in the muggy heat. And as I drove kind of almost parallel with it and the sun behind it, I could see there was a gap between what would be legs and the crotch area, and also a gap from the armpits down. And just then, as I'm staring at that, trying to figure out, am I seeing what I'm seeing? It actually turned, and there was water dripping off of the hands and the fur, but the fur was very thick. And I told my daughter, oh my gosh, I just saw one. And she looked back, and the only thing she could see was the stump in the middle of the lake, and just caught a glimpse of it. But it was pretty remarkable to see that there. And of course, I've driven that road to Iowa several times because my in-laws live there, and there was no stump in the middle of that pond. So that was my fourth sighting. My fifth sighting, I was on a business trip in Georgia. I had been there once prior and kind of scoped out an area near Red Top Mountain Park, which is kind of north and west of Atlanta. And I went up there the one evening with my thermal, and I tried to entice some action and whatever. The only thing I ended up finding was deer. And some of the deer got really mad at me and were huffing at me in the dark, which was kind of an unsettling sound. 3 years later, here I am back in Georgia and ran some training sessions, and I finished the day up and I was going to head out there. And one of my coworkers who knew about my hobby said, I was telling my son that you were going to be in town and we'd love to go out with you. So I said, great. So my coworker and his son, I meet up with them and I drive them out to I figured I'd still try the same location that I'd been in before. And we get up there and we hike in and we don't make any sounds at all. And just looking through the thermal, and about 40 minutes goes by. And then I notice about 150 feet down the reservoir, towards the reservoir, the slope, there was tall brush. And in that brush, I could see a heat signature behind it that was moving around. In that movement, you really couldn't see anything other than just alternating differential between the brush around it and the heat signature. And I passed the scope back and forth with my coworker and his son, and they all agreed that there's something there. So he had brought along a couple scraps of 2x4, and I said, why don't you just maybe do 2 knocks with the 2x4s? So he did the 2 knocks with the 2x4s, and with that, the heat signature abruptly stopped moving, and then all of a sudden it moved a little bit and went right over to this tree that was right in that area. And the tree at that time, I didn't know what it was, but the tree went up with a straight trunk and then it did a Y shape of the trunk. And in real time on the thermal, in watching the video real time, you could see the gaps in between the fingers as it reached up into that Y shape of the tree and pulled itself up into the tree. And you could see the face, and it starts looking around like, where did that knock come from? But it hoisted itself up just with one arm to look around. And I passed the scope over to my friend's son, who looked at it and he could see it very clearly. Of course, I had it recording this whole time. And then I passed it over to my coworker and he starts looking in the wrong direction. So I don't think he got a really good view of it. I think he saw it just as it went down, but by that time, it was pretty indistinct. But so I was pretty happy with that. And by that time, it was pretty late and we had to be back at work early in the morning. So we ended up calling it a night. And the next day after I finished training, I drove back up there in daylight, and I measured, and from the bottom of the tree up to that Y shape was 12 feet. So whatever it was reached up 12 feet, grabbed that nook and lifted itself up to look around. Also, as it turned out, the tree was a black walnut tree. And based on all of the tree litter that was on the ground, because this was, I believe it was early December in Georgia, and on the ground, you could see that something had been digging and foraging in that area. However, when we went back and looked at the thermal recording on the SD card, when the thermal ends up saving images, especially when it's that far away, it actually loses resolution as it compresses it to get it onto the SD card. So while you can see that there's something there, to me it looks like a heat blob, which really isn't much evidence at all, unfortunately. So that takes care of that sighting. So that brings me to the 6th sighting, which I had decided to return back in 2014 to that same meadow in my research canyon in Arizona. And this time I had decided that I was going to try to hike down into the canyon from a different direction. It was May. It was still very cold. It was maybe like 52 for a high during the day and getting down into the mid to low 20s at night. And I had parked on the east side of the canyon, and then I hiked in and I found a game trail that I'd never found before that went down into the canyon. And this time I brought a video camera, a handheld video camera, and I had that running. And I hiked down this game trail. The wind was blowing from west to east. So if there was anything in the canyon, any smell that I had certainly would be moving out of the canyon, so that was masking me as well. As not only that, but the sound of the wind in the trees and everything was really masking any footfalls that I was making. So it was really an ideal condition. And as it turned out, this game trail went all the way down to the base of the canyon. So just before I stepped out of the canyon, I had my video camera, I had it running, and I stepped out of the darkness onto the meadow and filming to the south. And as I'm holding the camera out in front of me at arm's length, so I can look at the fold out viewfinder on it, I'm videotaping that hillside, and out of my peripheral vision to my right, I see some movement. Well, your natural reaction is just to turn your head and take a look. And as I take a look, there's about 120 feet away from me across the meadow, on the edge of the other side of the meadow, is a Sasquatch crouched down, its knees kind of up in the air, its butt almost touching the ground, but its feet planted on the ground. So it's just in a crouch position. And in between its legs, it's digging or picking at some things at the base of this fallen tree. And I saw that for maybe a second or two, that I just looked at it. And in that moment, all of a sudden, it stopped digging and looked up at me. Now, I wasn't making a sound at all, and I really wasn't moving at all, but it knew I was there. I don't know how else to explain that. And it stared right at me, and we locked eyes for a second, and then it jumped up, erupted, and later on, when I went back and measured, its very first step from almost a crouching sitting position to its first step that it took was 6 feet away. And then the next step after that was 7 feet away as it ran. It bounded, it erupted off the ground. And anything that went from looking like almost a tree stump on the ground, and if it wasn't digging, I may not have even noticed it. But it went from a small stump-shaped object to something that was 8 feet tall and massive. And it turned, and 2 steps, and actually I turned it right as it made its second step into the brush. So in the video, you can actually see the brush moving. You can hear trees crashing as it ran through the trees. I tell people that it sounded more like if someone was up on that ridge line, the same ridge line I had my second sighting on, it sounded like somebody had rolled a car off the top of that ridge and it was just coming through the trees. It was an incredible sound, the crashing sound. So here I am now filming to the west, and the only thing I'm capturing is tree movement and crashing sounds. And then back off to my left in the same direction that I was initially filming, I could hear 2 or 3 other crashes heading up the hill on the other side out of the canyon. So it was a little scary being by myself and seeing that subject jump the way it did. It was astonishing. The other thing that, and I know I didn't put this, if you end up reading any of my blogs that are out on ghosthuntingtheories.com, you can go in the search panel and just search for Karl Sup, and you'll find a lot of the blogs that I've written on my research. And I know I didn't write it out there, but I'll give you a little extra. As it jumped from that squatting position up, I'll just say one thing. Sasquatch are not circumcised, okay? That's about all I'm going to say about that. But if I describe the face is almost a dark grayish, you know what, I'll have to see if I can come up with a really good name. It's not even like a navy gray skin. It's darker than that. But there was no whites of the eyes. The eyes were just solid color. It could have been brown, seemed to be black, but there was just absolutely no whites of the eyes. But the face was fairly human. The nose was a little flatter than ours, but just astonishing. And his hair color was kind of like that reddish, a little more darker brown, but with a red tinge to it. So I don't know if it's the same individual that I saw in my second sighting, but certainly the correct approximate size and the speed that he took off in was incredible once again. But it's human nature just to turn to look at something, and you don't expect to see what you see, and it takes a few seconds for all your muscle reactions to kick in to turn around in order to look at that. So that was that sighting. That was a pretty incredible sighting. So that takes you just through 6 sightings that I've had. I've had a total of 11, most of which are actually up at ghosthuntingtheories.com. If you'd like to read those. My next 3 sightings were in Chicago. I did a lot of research in the Chicago suburbs. I consider myself fairly experienced at discovering or finding Sasquatch in urban areas. I've also spent a lot of time in the woods of Long Island, and you don't think about finding them on Long Island, but there's certainly some unique techniques I came up with in order to figure out where they could live, and then eventually discovering where they were living. And it truly surprised me where I could find them on there. So those are really interesting research things you can read about online, and maybe I'll detail those in my next visit.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves in the plow, and the 5-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.